Okay, so we can, oh, also, yeah, the important thing. I am a, Camp Constitution is a charitable trust, and I am the only full-time person. I like to tell people I get paid weekly, W-E-A-K-L-Y, it's a labor of love. And just like I'm sure school teachers, they don't get a whole lot, especially up here. But I do have, and I know people help me out with putting me up in their homes or their guest rooms. I know back here I stayed at your place a number of times and pick up a tab for a meal or what have you. But I get gas expenses, and I've got an old clunker with 250,000 miles, so I rented a car. I didn't dare take it up here with me. So anything would be appreciated, you know. And if you do write a check, you can check out the Camp Constitution, so you can just sort of pass the basket there. Just pretend you're in a Baptist church, you know, and pass the basket. So. Now, if you don't like what I have to say, you can't take any money out. That's the only stipulation. Okay, so we can begin. Just give me the thumbs up. I'll take that call. I think once you ready?
Yes.
All right. As I get ready, I get this pop. All right. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Hal Shurtleff. I am the director for Camp Constitution. We are a charitable trust based in New Hampshire. I live in Boston, Massachusetts, and I'm very pleased that you're here. And I just want to let you know a little bit about some of the things we do. We have a YouTube channel, and this video will hopefully be placed. This presentation will be uploaded on YouTube, and we're getting about 30,000 views a month, so we're kind of pleased with that. We'd like to get a whole lot more, so I do encourage you to go to our YouTube channel and subscribe to it and share the videos. We have close to 700 videos from a lot of our classes at camp, some great materials, plus things we do year-round. The Sam Blumenfeld Archive, which is a free resource for educators, homeschoolers, researchers, historians. Sam was a pioneer in the homeschool movement, and we inherited his library. And thanks to two very talented people that are a whole lot more talented than I can even imagine, Eric Conver, our webmaster, and Mark Affleck, who is our camp newspaper editor, they put this together. And last year we got 2 million views from this. So, and we're just a relatively small organization, but we have a lot of big stuff to offer. And so I know this topic is called the deep state, and I always have materials. If somebody says they're Hal Shurtleff and they show up and they don't have a book table, it's not the real Hal Shurtleff, okay? Somebody was talking about, a former colleague of mine was on Facebook, and he was talking about what he wants to have at his wake, at his funeral. And I said, I want a literature table at my funeral. You're going to get a lot of conservative right-wing types. I might as well have a book table, you know? My wife would say, good, I got a barn loaded with books I want to get rid of anyway, right? So, by the way, we don't get rid of material, we distribute material, right? We get rid of trash, right? So, anyway, I do have some things that are germane to this topic. One of them, I think, was one of the most important books that I read in 1988. I literally bumped into the author. It's called Shadows of Power by James Perloff. Mr. Perloff was a former leftist atheist, and he had a big change of heart. Back in the 60s, he was a college student, and you know, one of these burn baby burn and down with the system and all that kind of stuff. He actually didn't burn anything, but he was one of those, you know, 60s type radicals. But he asked questions, and some people don't like you asking questions because you may not, the answers you get, they may not like. He said, why are the establishment foundations backing our organizations? Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, these are the bad guys, these are the big oil guys, right? And then he came up with some possible answers. One, they're afraid of us and they're trying to, you know, buy ourselves off. Two, they're trying to control us. Or maybe three, they created us to begin with. And he looked into that, and it brought him to a group called the Council on Foreign Relations. And this wasn't a bunch of conspiracy theory stuff. He got it from their own writings. He went to the Boston Public Library. Back in the 80s, you didn't have internet. I think it was just relatively new. Just universities talking to each other, right? Al Gore didn't, you know, finish working on inventing it yet. So he did. Right, he got all the books and writings and papers of these folks, and he put this together. So this is an important, very important. And he's become a friend. He's an instructor at camp, or has been in the past. Another former colleague of mine was Ed Griffin, who wrote a great book on the Federal Reserve Bank called Creature from Jekyll Island. His very first book was called The Fearful Master, A Second Look at the UN. And the UN is one of these international deep state entities that has tentacles right here in your state through something called Agenda 21, which I'm not going to get into a whole lot today. That's another. Another man who was an instructor at our camp who passed away last year, Dr. Michael Kaufman from Bangor, Maine, Saviors of the Earth. This was and Mike was another man. He was a real scientist, not a political scientist, but a real scientist. And he was part of the Acid Rain Participation Project to look into the possibilities that there was acid rain was causing lakes to die. And what he found as a scientist, most of these lakes were naturally had levels of acid, but because of the techniques of forest fires, there weren't as many forest fires, so the ashes would wash into the lake, and it would be, it would reduce the acid level. But he said a lot of these lakes were naturally high acidic levels, and you could simply solve the problem very inexpensively. Well, that wasn't the report that the powers that be that wanted. He said, we don't want this report. He said, well, this is a scientific result. This isn't political science. But science became politicized. So he really got into and had to obviously leave that profession. And he wrote a number of books, but this one was one of the earliest called Saviors of the Earth. And his widow sent me a whole batch of them, and there's an excellent book. It goes into the philosophical underpinnings of many of the people in the environmental movement, what they believe or what have you. And most people in the movement, I think, are well-intentioned people. I call them true believers. They actually, and believe me, I like clean air and clean water, and you'll see me picking up litter and picking up broken glass in my neighborhood all the time. I don't see a lot of progressive freethinkers doing this, unfortunately. Anyway, we also have I have some back issues of a very important magazine called The New American. These go back more than a few years, but they're timeless information, and all of this is donation only. So, with that, I want to get into it, and there's a lot of slides here, and I'm going to sort of I don't want to go beyond, let's say, a little after 10, so I get the clock in front of me. There's an old saying, what does it mean when a Baptist preacher puts his wristwatch on the podium? That doesn't mean anything, right? Keep on speaking. I know when to stop when people are falling asleep, though, or, giving me dirty looks. But anyway, the deep state, U.S. under siege. Can you all see that without too much difficulty? Yeah, okay.
You'll need to move to the other side once.
Oh, really? Okay. Defining the deep state bureaucrats, deep state intelligence, deep state money, deep state behind the deep state agenda, deep state and Trump, defanging the deep state. So I'm going to try to go into all these things to a small extent. We've all heard the term deep state. Now, how long have we heard this term? It's kind of relatively new, right? Maybe the last couple of years. Prior to this, the term New World Order. You remember when Daddy Bush got in front of a joint session of Congress, like 1991, when he announced the Gulf War? And that just was, first one, it was Operation Desert Shield, then it became Desert Storm. And I'll never forget, because he said, what we have here is a real chance at what? This New World Order. And then he defined it. A UN is envisioned by its founders. Now, I have an associate's degree from a junior college. I know who the founders of the UN were. He went to Yale. He was the head of the CIA. You think he would know? But he's assuming that the average American has no idea because of the incredible propaganda that the American people have had over the years. They just assume this is a great organization. They don't know that it was founded. The man who wrote the charter, you know who wrote the charter for the UN? A man named Alger Hiss, who happened to be a Soviet agent. That's the guy who wrote the UN charter. And I asked this question, sort of rhetorically, what good can come from the pen of, not only was he a Soviet, he was a Stalinist agent, from the pen of a Stalinist agent. And I would say, just like our Constitution, most people haven't read the UN charter. So, anyway, so polls by ABC News, Washington Post, show nearly half of Americans believe in the deep state in the federal government. Defined as military intelligence and government officials who try to secretly manipulate government policy. Plurality, 48% think the deep state exists, while only a third, 35%, say it's only a conspiracy theory. You see, when there's enough evidence, instead of examining the evidence, people have that knee-jerk response. It's a conspiracy theory. But even a theory, isn't a theory sort of an educated guess? Isn't that what they call a theory? Why is that? And I know there are some crazy shapeshifter conspiracy theories, and there's a lot of, I'm of the opinion that some of these theories are manufactured deliberately to make all the truth look ridiculous. I'm convinced of that. You know, in the wake of the bombing, the marathon bombing in Boston, someone said, oh, well, they had legless veterans that were paid to lay there. And I said, look, I know people that, I have one of our campers was there, and her ears have been ringing for a whole week, so don't tell me that this was, you know, that was just, nobody was hurt. Don't tell me that. Make people look. I said, don't say that, because you make yourself look pretty dumb when you do stuff like that, right? Younger Americans, and this is a very encouraging thing, more likely to believe 60% under 30 years. Now, they may define it differently, but at least they realize that something's not quite right. So there's been numerous articles about the subject. Eric Snowden, we all know what Eric Snowden. I think, is he still in Russia? I don't even know where he is now. He said there is definitely a deep state. Trust me, I've been there. And it's not just Republicans saying it's the Democrats. It's the Democrats saying it might be the Republicans. And this is Dennis Kucinich, former congressman. I think he was mayor of Ohio too, wasn't he? And he said the same thing. FBI report. FBI. Now it's interesting. Back in the '60s, the left hated the FBI. Right? The people used to answer the phone, and you know they would curse J. Hoover instead of saying hello. That's how they answer the phone. Now the FBI is this wonderful organization that does have nothing but the best interest of the American people. It's kind of interesting how that works. There have been regular organized meetings of large numbers of government workers where plans have been discussed to actively sabotage government programs they disagree with. And we all know what happened with the FBI under Comey. We all know what they did with Trump and bugging the Trump towers and things. And I didn't know this entity existed until recently. Just like I didn't know there was such a thing as a vaccine court, a U.S. government vaccine court. How many knew there was a vaccine court? Yeah, I know you would, yeah. And that was done in the 70s. And vaccine companies, or Big Pharma, is indemnified. If there's an award at this vaccine court, the taxpayers pick up the tab, yeah. So anyway, highest level government managers, buffer between appointees and bureaucracy, almost 8,000 members, about 70% appointed to SEC during Obama's term. And you see, these people under civil service laws, they're there forever. So, you know, elected people are just there sometimes, you know, a couple of terms, but they're there for for several decades, maybe even more. General Patton, the son, made a comment about civil servants. He said, they're like broken cannons. They don't work and you can't fire them. Now some do work, I'm sure. There are some. And by the way, I don't want to say that every government official isn't part of some deep state. Most of them are well-intentioned people. Deep state became a popular term among Trump supporters to describe the machine trying to stop, smear, sabotage Trump. And every single day, you know. In people that Trump backs, there's a guy running for Congress down in Florida. I just watched it yesterday, and he won the primary. And he said something about we shouldn't be monkeying around. And then, you know, and one of the guy on CNN, was it Don Lemon? He made that term, and he said this is a horrible racist term, and his opponent happens to be black. This got it was absolutely no intention. It was not meant to be. And then there was a clip of Obama saying the same thing, you know, 7 or 8 years ago, but no one called him a racist, you know, when he said that. I mean, it's getting ridiculous, and I think this overkill is opening up a lot of people's eyes too. Trump slams criminal deep state. Deep state defined in 2014 by Mike Lofgren, former U.S. congressional aide, a hybrid association of elements of government and parts of top-level finance and industry that is effectively able to govern the United States without reference to the consent of the governed, as expressed through the formal political process, or, could I say, extra-constitutional as well. And there's a copy of the book that you can probably get on Amazon for short money. I'm going to skip that a little bit. Bureaucratic Deep State, nice little cartoon, includes nearly 3 million civilian federal employees, according to the Office of Personnel Management. And again, I'm not suggesting that all 3 million of them are any part of the deep state. Some people just do what they're told to do. They want to keep their job. They better do this. How many people I've heard, you know, they can't do certain things. I have some friends who work at City Hall in Boston, and they're afraid to say boo, you know, and they're conservative-minded people because they might lose their job, or if they don't lose their job, they'll be harassed and have all kinds of problems. That does not include the more than 2 million in the armed services, or of the 20 million government employees at the state and local level. And some of them are part-time, not everybody. The little towns like this, you know, you don't have a whole lot of, what I'm saying, up in this area. It was very nice. I went to the town of Dorchester, New Hampshire one time. And I usually, in my travels, I'll visit local libraries and leave books and things there. And the town hall, it said, closed. It said that the town manager resigned. There's no government in Dorchester until the next election. I looked around and the grass was still green and the sun still came up and there was no government. I don't know how that happened. It was a libertarian's dream, you know, to go to a town with no government. People are self-governing, you see. They had no police there either, you know. Hundreds of bureaucracies, agencies, departments, sub-agencies, and more. Official estimates on the number of agencies range as high as 430 or even higher. Regardless of agency, almost all givers gave to Hillary. Now, this is a chart. And by the way, these slides are available. I'd be happy to share them with you. This is part of the board. So all the people at the federal level, agriculture, commerce, defense, education, on and on, 85% or more gave to, when they donated to campaigns, they gave to Hillary. So that's just a little chunk, just a hand, you know, less than 5%, maybe 6%. You would think the Veterans Administration would be at least 50%, right? No, most of them gave to Hillary. And in defense too, 84% gave to Hillary. So it's pretty amazing. So that tells you the mindset of these people. I worked in the post office for about 5 years, and I did work. Some people had a job there, and some people worked, and I was one of the ones that worked. And there were people there that didn't agree with a lot of the policy. I think who was running? Reagan was in office at the time. I think Dukakis. He said, "Well, I don't like Dukakis, but I have to vote for him because Reagan's I'm going to lose my job under Reagan." Well, it didn't work. It didn't happen. He didn't go after the post office. Here is Biden. Biden is telling people, "Stay put." He said, "They call me all the time." He says, "Please stay. Please stay. There has to be some competence and normalcy." So he's telling the people in the bureaucracies that don't. No, Trump is an aberration. He'll be gone in a few years and we can get back to business. See, he understands that. He wrote an essay one time, an article, "How I Come to Love the New World Order," or something to that effect. It's online. At least 78 of Obama's political appointees even burrowed into top-level civil service jobs, according to a report from the Government Accountability Office. So these people that were appointed, when they left, they got themselves in this. A lot of them become lobbyists, but in this case, they are top-level civil service jobs. Far more than previous presidents. Essentially, they cannot be removed under civil service laws. Close to 500,000 federal regulations with criminal penalties. You know, one of the first things that Trump did was sign an executive order to repeal some of the regulations. And he said that for every new regulation, you're going to repeal two. I kind of like that. That's what they call administrative laws. See, Congress is supposed to make all laws, right? Article 1, Section 1. But you have these bureaucracies, the IRS, at the city level, state level, that just write these, they call it administrative laws. IRS is administrative court, you know. So that's all of it's extra constitutional. Now, there was a documentary that came out back, it was 05 or 04. It was called From Freedom to Fascism by Aaron Russo. Aaron Russo was the one who produced a couple of Bette Midler movies. And I did interview him on the phone. I never met the man, but I did interview him on the, he's since passed away. And he interviewed an attorney, and the attorney said something to the effect that it's impossible not to break a law. If you own a business, basically the minute you open up the door, put on the light, you probably violated some law. And this is another book that corroborates that. Virtually every American commits multiple federal crimes each day without knowing, according to the 3 felonies a day. How the feds target the innocent by attorney Harvey Silvergate. And I think he's a Harvard professor. And this is another quote from Professor John Baker. "There is no one in the United States over the age of 18 who cannot be indicted for some federal crime." And you know, there used to be a saying, "Don't make a federal case of it." You remember hearing that saying? Now everything's a federal case. You know, if a guy's in the workforce and he says to his co-worker, "Your hair looks nice," that's a federal, that's harassment, or could be, you know. It's amazing, it's insane. Deep state targets. Now here's a deep stater, without, in my opinion, without any hesitation right there, Robert Mueller. Considering fishing expedition against Trump by Special Counsel Robert Mueller, longtime deep state operative. Vicious takedown of Trump's first national security advisor, Mike Flynn, appears to have been a clear-cut example of deep state taking enemies. And there's a lot of cartoons of the deep state. Trump caused deep state to expose itself. Average of 1 leak per day. Obama used That's the GCHQ, to spy on Trump's people despite official denials skirting records and laws. Unmasked scandal involved top Obama officials. I mean, Watergate was a bad thing, but Watergate was really mild compared to what's going on here. I'm not a big Bob Dylan fan, but one line in the lyrics, one of his songs, when you steal a little, they put you in jail. You Bob Dylan fans? When you steal a lot, they make you king. You know. Now this was. I remember when Schumer said this. I think I was watching. I don't watch a lot of news. I'm not on the news. I'm watching all the time. But Schumer was on Rachel Maddow. Let me tell you, you take on the intelligence community. They have 6 ways from Sunday at getting back at you. So even for a practical, supposedly hard-nosed businessman, he's been really dumb to do this. So he's admitting that not only does this entity exist, but they're vicious and vindictive. Now, the president he's in charge of the executive branch. All these people are supposed to serve under him. So the tail's wagging the dog, it looks like, right? And by the way, the president is not supposed to be the most powerful man in the free world. You will not find that in the Constitution. He has limited powers. In fact, Congress has most, but unfortunately Congress has been giving so many powers over the years to the executive branch, and both parties are responsible. I want to clear that up. Intelligence community. We used to have, when I was in the Army, to say Army intelligence, that's an oxymoron, right? Anyway, 16 no bureaucracies, CIA, DSA, DIA. You know, prior to World War II, we had naval intelligence. You didn't have a whole lot. You didn't have an international intelligence. The FBI was just sort of getting started. They were just basically there to gather information. They didn't even have the power of arrest. The Wall Street Journal says there are 1,250 government organizations, 2,000 companies, 10,000 locations, almost 1 million with top secret clearances. That's amazing. And of course, Silicon Valley is very much involved in helping snooping on American people. Deep State wanted ISIS. Yeah, so people have a hard time getting around that. And I don't have books on this subject right now here, but when they were going after Trump, that somehow Putin put Trump in power, and he's beholden to the Kremlin. Conservative anti-communists have been saying stuff like this for years, not against Trump, and we're called conspiracy theorists. Since 1917, elements in our government or in our country have supported, aided, and abated the Soviet Union. There's a man named Anthony Sutton. You want to write that name down, if you like. He was a professor at the Hoover Institute in California, and he wrote about 6 books, and one of them was called National Suicide, American Aid to the Soviet Union. That came out in 1974. He was going to be a speaker at the 1972 Republican Party convention, and when it was found out what he was going to talk about, they said, no, you're not going to speak. I remember I was in Germany, and I saw evidence of that as a soldier in Germany. Some evidence of that. Henry Kissinger was one of the deep staters that was responsible for a lot of the technological transfers, and all this is documented. This isn't some, again, conspiracy theory. He also wrote a book called Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, and The Best Enemy Money Can Buy, and many other books. So all well documented that we've been doing it. And on our YouTube channel, you will find an interview, a few interviews that he did. My wife said, you're talking too long now. Wrap it up.
Competition.
Okay. So here, Trump, in many respects, ISIS is honoring President Obama. He's the founder of ISIS. He's the founder. He founded ISIS, and I would say the co-founder would be crooked Hillary Clinton. But of course, it goes to both parties too. It's not just one party. And again, I can point to Nixon, to even to Ronald Reagan. I know Ronald Reagan is loved by many people in the conservative camp, but you look at what he did in China, most favored nation trading status. Anyway, going on in technological transfers. In fact, Charlotte Isabet, you know who Charlotte Isabet is? She worked for the Reagan administration and Department of Education, and she was a whistleblower. And some of the stuff that was going on with the Soviet Union and the Department of Education back in the early 80s. Then there's all these false flag operations, historically, Operation Northwoods. Speaking of Cuba, I don't know if I mentioned Cuba earlier, but U.S. Ambassador to the Cuba, Earl Smith, we, the U.S., are responsible for bringing Castro into power. People would say that Fidel Castro got his job to the New York Times. Back in the early 60s, he was called the George Washington of Cuba. He was this wonderful freedom fighter. He had nothing to do with communism, yet the ambassador to Cuba said he was a communist, and he was known to be a communist since the early 50s, where he was doing stuff in South America. And then when he finally said, I am a convinced communist and will be all my life, people, oh, we never knew that. Well, no, you're lying. Now here's another deep state activist, Mr. John Brennan. Interesting that in 1976 he voted for Communist Party candidate Gus Hall. There are a lot of Americans, when they watch Hollywood, they think the CIA, a bunch of all anti-communists, they want to get commies out of power. Just the opposite is true. In fact, here's a question. I'm sure not too many people in the room know the answer. Who was the first public official, elected official, to publicly criticize the CIA? You'd be surprised to learn that it was that wicked, horrible Joe McCarthy. One reason why he's not too well liked, right? The CIA used to be called the OSS. The OSS was founded during World War II. Bill Donovan was the leader of that. And when it was brought to his attention that there were communists in the OSS, they somehow infiltrated, he said, no, we hired them. They didn't infiltrate. You know that show, Firing Line, with Pat Buchanan's not on anymore. Pat Buchanan used to have I can't remember the co-host. He's since passed away. He was a former CIA man. One of his guests was the late Larry McDonald, congressman from Georgia, whose plane was shot out of the sky in 1983 by the Soviets, Korean airliner he was in. And this fellow, his first name was Tom, I can't remember his last name, but he's actually trying to get Larry McDonald to trip himself up and, you know, kind of mock him and ridicule him. And he said something to the effect, well, the CIA was funding the communist newspaper in New York City. And Pat Buchanan couldn't believe it. And this guy, Tom, said, yeah, we were doing that. The CIA was funding the Communist Party newspaper, yeah. So here's a guy that should not have ever got a clearance. He shouldn't be working as a parking lot attendant, and my apologies to the hard-working parking lot attendants around the country, most of whom probably should be in the CIA to be better than this guy. And I remember just recently, he's appealing to the American people, you know, appealing to your patriotism. We've got to get this horrible guy out of office. It's awful. I never see this guy at any Tea Party rallies. Have you? Does he come to your meetings? I've never seen him at any of these meetings, right? Yeah. Now, historically, here is a Soviet spy and defector, Elizabeth Bentley, testified that she collected dues for Communist Party USA from high-ranking OSS officials in Washington. You remember the Venona papers that came out when the Soviet Union sort of imploded back in the 90s? Well, they listed that there were 200 deep state communists, among them Duncan Lee, confidential assistant to OSS founder Chief William Donovan, head of the China section, and many, many more. In fact, I remember I had a letter in the newspaper on opposing NAFTA, and a guy wrote back to me. I had a nice letter. His last name was Field. I can't remember his name. He said that even though he's a progressive socialist, he said he agrees with me and appreciates what I have to say. He said, my uncle, I think his name was Noel Field, was a State Department Red who had to leave the country when he was exposed as a communist. So here's a guy that said, my uncle was a communist and he was in the State Department. So I'll kind of skip over that. Deep state intel crimes, torture, mass murder, gun running, drug trafficking, illegal spying, kidnapping, regime change. Other than that, they don't really have much to do. And by the way, both parties, both major parties. This isn't a Democrat-Republican thing. But who are the real terrorists? I saw your truck there. You have some bumper stickers on your truck, sir. You are a terrorist. How many people are military veterans who are serving? You know, how many people belong to a pro-life group or conservative? How many people read their Constitution? Oh, you are a terrorist, according to some people in the deep state. And returning veterans from the Gulf or from Afghanistan are also potential terrorists. But the real terrorists, nah. Antifa, nah, they're just ideologues. And of course, if you happen to believe in God and the Bible, evangelical Christianity, for example, we can't raise a flag on a public access flagpole. We have a lawsuit, by the way, that made a lot of news this last few days. But you can raise the flag of Cuba, the flag of China, the rainbow flag, the ISIS flag, not the ISIS flag, well, not yet anyway. So here's a deep state torture. I don't mean to show. You remember the Abu Ghraib? I'm pronouncing it right. You know, and who actually was punished for that? Some low-level people, right? But these low-level people were ordered to do what they did. There's no question about that. So in some cases, if we're not doing it ourselves, we are paying, you know, it's called extraordinary rendition, right? So I capture somebody and I turn them over to non-Americans, and they take care of business. So I didn't torture anybody. The thing about torture, you don't really get what you're looking for anyway. It's not really the, it's first of all, we're supposed to have Christian morals. We shouldn't be torturing. It doesn't matter what the other guys do. We shouldn't be doing it. And I've had a friend of mine, he's no longer a friend, that justified it. And I say, you know, when people are being tortured, they'll say almost anything under duress. You know, and most military people around the world, it's almost like a need-to-know basis. When I had a secret clearance, I didn't know a whole lot. But I had a secret clearance because I was in the perimeter of where the special weapons were that had the nuclear capabilities. I didn't have a top secret clearance. And if I was captured, if I was captured and tortured, you know, I might have just said the information that would be almost useless to them. So a lot of times these people have no information to begin with, and it's just a sad thing to see that happen. Deep state secret prisons, and there's some of them around the world. Remember, was it Obama that was going to close Gitmo? Is it still open? He could have closed it. That shows you the deep state. They said, oh no, Mr. President, we're not closing. But I'm the president. I'm the boss here. That's the executive branch. Deep state mass murder tools, drones. And you know, there are legitimate, when there's like a bombing, you're bombing a military target or a factory producing weapons. And sometimes it's what they call collateral damage. It's something that's unfortunate, but in war that happens. And by the way, we haven't been at war since 1941. We haven't declared war, so they call we're at war, but we're not really at war. And you know why we're not at war? Why they don't declare war? I'm not in favor of declaring war for the sake of declaring war, because in 1945 Congress passed the unconstitutional UN Participation Act. So the UN Security Council is the one that declares war for us now, unelected people from all parts of the world. So we went to Korea, we went to Vietnam, undeclared. It's called a police action. You know what a police action is? You call 911 and say there's someone trying to break into my house, and police show up. That's a police action. Sending soldiers dying overseas, and they call it a police action. There's no police action in the Constitution. It's not in there. So you can't see it too well, but it says anywhere between 64 to over 800 people were killed, innocent people were killed just in the last 8 years by drone strikes. And here's a couple of the deep state victims here. Total innocents that were involved. And you don't see the corporate media talk, but this happened during the Obama. I'm sure if this happened last week, you'd hear about it. You'd hear all of these talking heads. It's like the same talking heads that were so horrified at the horrible mistreatment of the people coming in here illegally. And when they do, and they're simply, it's like Trump is somehow ripping babies from their mother's breast. That's the picture you get. When it's been the policy, you know, if I break the law, and if I come into in front of a bank when my children were little, and I held the bank up, they're going to arrest me and they're going to put my children in the state, the DSS, or whatever they call it. Is it the policeman's fault for putting me in jail because I committed a crime? No, I'm not suggesting coming here illegally is as bad as robbing a bank, but you break a law, you should. And a lot of these children are being used as pawns. And anyone with a little bit of intelligence and morality realizes that. So here's a guy bragging about mass murder. Senior intelligence official told the Washington Post that the CIA has been turned into one hell of a killing machine. Former leader of the CIA and NSA, Michael Hayden, caught on video in 2014, this may be on YouTube, bragging in public about how the intelligence apparatus murders people based just on their data. I'm going to just sort of skip some of this here. Even Congress is not safe. In 2014, Senator Dianne Feinstein, and I'm not a big fan of hers, accused CIA of spying on Senate Select Intelligence Committee investigating CIA torture. CIA deleted files from committee's computers. It may have undermined the constitutional framework essential to effective congressional oversight of intelligence activities or any other government function. That's what Feinstein. So you know things are bad when liberal Democrats are making reference to the Constitution and they're correct about it. You know, that's pretty interesting. How about the gun running? Remember Operation Fast and Furious, where some American border agents were killed? Violence blamed on the Second Amendment. It was you guys that were really responsible. You evil, wicked gun owners are responsible. Top officials perjured themselves, and how many went to jail over it? Can you hear the crickets? Yeah. You're not hearing any cell door slamming. Drug running. I remember there was in Boston. There's a newspaper that's mainly a black audience, the Bay State Banner, and they were blaming the CIA for bringing drugs into many of the inner cities. But white people don't care. So I got this paper late at night, and I was so upset about it. I wrote it. It took me about 2 hours to get this letter right, and I sent it to the paper. I said, yes, there are plenty of white people that care, but you've been conditioned to told that we're your enemies. We're the racists. You're the American, the patriot community that is trying to warn you folks, and you don't want. And they ran the letter too. I was very surprised. Cocaine for illegal intervention. There's a book called Red Cocaine. Very interesting book by. Came out in the early mid-90s, and how the Soviet bloc deliberately brought the cocaine into the country. Now most of the heroin is coming from China. The fentanyl and the stuff that's killing our children is coming through China, through South Africa and up to the eastern coast. Deep state regime change. Let's see, 7 governments: Iran, Guatemala, Congo, Dominican Republic, South Vietnam. South Vietnam was a miserable thing. You had, in the 50s, you had a lot of viable groups out there that were handling the communists, and they were all destroyed by our elements in our government. And they put up a man named Diem, and Diem was the great leader of South Vietnam, and then he was assassinated. And there was nothing but instability therefore until the communists took over, and we lost, what, 56,000 men died? And how many of them came back with all kinds of problems? I had my dear friend, her husband just passed away. He was a victim of Agent Orange, you know, and he was sick, you know, for a good part of his life because of it, you know. So, 1950 declassified memo by OSS Boss Donovan outlines plan to create European Parliament, which now exists. Yeah, the EU was really hatched in New York City. Now there were elements in obviously Europe that were part of it, and David Rockefeller sat on that. And I'm going to be getting into David a while ago. Yeah. Intel-backed unions, Tower of Babel. This was actually their own one of their own programs. They actually had a Tower of Babel in their promotion, and that's what the EU Parliament looks like today. A lot like the Tower of, you know, the fable of the Tower of Babel from the Bible. MK Ultra, mind control. That stuff that was involved in by our governments, CIA. Deep state propaganda. Operation Mockingbird exposed and declassified documents aimed to hijack media to promote propaganda. CIA recruited hundreds of journalists, media, execs, and that's why you can almost count on these stories how the same newspapers have the same spin. CNN, NBC, CNBC. It's just a question of we want to say something more sensational to get the viewer's attention, but they're all. Here's a guy who was, I say, one of the pinnacle deep state, he was a conservative. It was Bill Buckley's job to be the gatekeeper. Bill Buckley was the one that said if you were a real conservative, a legitimate conservative or not. And if you weren't, you were smeared and ridiculed. There was a great book on there, it's called The Pied Piper of the Establishment. He was a CIA man, he was a Council on Foreign Relations member, and he was the left's favorite conservative. Deep state money. I don't want to get too much into the Federal Reserve Bank. That's I don't want to spend too much time. But let's just say that we don't have real money. We haven't had any since the Federal Reserve Bank came around, and little by little, you know, we had gold-backed currency. We even had silver coins, and all that's done away with. And so the money's just printed up. Trillions of dollars are just printed up and distributed, and we use that money to bail out big corporations, like twice under Bush and under Obama. Trillions of dollars. Now, this is an important, this fellow here is a very important man, Carroll Quigley, and maybe if you're taking notes, write his name down. I actually have an interview he did on our YouTube channel, or you can find it on other channels. Who remembers watching or hearing about Bill Clinton's acceptance speech when he got the first nomination, when he first nominated for president? Anybody remember that? He paid homage to his old professor, who since passed away. He died in 1970, 77. He mentioned Carroll Quigley. Carroll Quigley groomed Bill Clinton. And I'm sure there was a lot of people who knew this guy around the country. Bill Clinton was basically saying, I'm your boy. Georgetown professor Carroll Quigley, a mentor to President Bill Clinton, close to the core of the deep state. He wrote a book called Tragedy and Hope. Here's that. And it's a thick tome of a book, and it's dry as can be, but there are some things that are really, really interesting. And he said that there does exist, much like the radical right, an international Anglophile network that operates much like the communists. And he said, I've seen it, I've been invited to observe them. My only problem is, and I'm paraphrasing just a little bit, is that he said they wish to remain secret. Now, when that book came out, it was published by Macmillan Company. They destroyed the plates. They couldn't get a second printing. Isn't that interesting? So it was bootlegged. Someone took it all overseas and bootlegged it. And instead of suing the guy, he said, just give me some royalties and we'll be fine. He actually, a little later, he met a man named Edward Hunter, another important man. Edward Hunter he was the one that coined the term brainwashing. He wrote a book about how the American POWs in Korea were treated. And he said, you still think these guys are good, huh? They did the same thing to my book. Interesting, back in the mid-90s, I debated a fellow, Teddy Conant, and I think he's still alive. He's in his mid-90s now. Teddy Conant, his father was one of the founders of the CIA. He was president of Harvard. And it was a little radio station in New Hampshire. And one of the stipulations was I had to give him a ride to the art museum in Boston. And I said, I'll be happy to. I live nearby. I wish I had my camera on or my recording on. What he told me in that ride, he said, if you ever repeat this to anybody, I will deny it, you know. But he said that a colleague of his wrote a book, sort of like a tell-all book. And he said the CIA was commissioned to steal the book in libraries all over the country. I said, I'm not surprised that's what they did to Carroll Quigley. You know? So very, very interesting. Okay, so, and what happened was that he passed away. A man named Dr. Stanley Monteith visited his widow and got some of his interviews, some of his recordings. I don't think the widow really knew what he had. And one of them was an interview he did with a reporter, and he just sort of spilling all this stuff. It was fascinating. He had a real heavy Boston accent, you know, that Harvard accent too. And of course you get the big banks. Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs is the big, they're the ones that would have been selling the carbon credits had they passed the carbon tax, or the Congress passed it back during the Obama administration. And they're looking at carbon credits as the new currency. That's something that they have planned. Mega banks too big to jail. You know, again, if you're a teller and you're embezzling a few $1,000s, you should be punished for that, by the way. But if you're embezzling billions of dollars, too big to go to jail. Where, like I said, our friend there in his lyrics, you know, steal little, you go to jail, steal a lot, they make you king or make you CEO. When I want to talk a little about the Rothschild dynasty, and when you mention that name, the first thing that comes up is anti-Semitic, anti-Semitic. Well, this has nothing to do with that. You have to, this is an entity that has a lot of influence, actually probably since the early 1800s. Have been the center of the world's financial markets for more than 200 years. Rothschild & Company can be closer to current issues than any other global financial institution in our core markets. That's what they're saying about themselves. The Rothschilds had decided the outcome of the Napoleonic Wars by putting their financial weight behind Britain, and this was in a book called The World's Bankers. And here is a more recent Rothschild, Baron Eric D. Rothschild, openly supported Bulgarian Communist Party operative as Secretary General of the United Nations. And of course, they helped George Soros. George Soros is the new David Rockefeller, you know, because back in the 70s, we'd blame everything on Rockefeller, now it's Soros, right? But Soros has a real horrible track record. Of course, he's admired by many people on the left. We visited his home in Nantucket. My son and two of my two daughters of a friend of mine. We left, nobody was home, but we left off information about Agenda 21. I don't know if you ever read it or not. Deep state business interlocking control, and transnational corporations form a giant bow tie structure. A large portion of control flows to a small, tight-knit core of financial institutions. And here's the book I mentioned earlier, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. And it just goes into all. What happened was Trotsky was living in the United States. In fact, my mother went to school with Trotsky's niece. And he was kicked out of Russia. He was going back, and he was on a ship, and there was $15 million of gold, I believe, real, hardcore gold, not just paper money. And it went up to Canada. Now, Canada is at war with Russia at the time, and they were going to take Russia out of the war, which Canada was at war with Germany, and if Russia got out of the war, there'd be more soldiers fighting Canadians and English, and this was before our involvement. So anyway, he stopped in Canada, and Woodrow Wilson said, leave him alone, let him out and let him go to Russia, and the rest is history. That money helped give us the Communist Revolution. And again, it's all documented, and I mentioned Shadows of Power. There's information about that in Shadows of Power, but this one, of course, is, and I read this book, and it's available. It's been put back in print a few times, but it's available where all books can be found. Central banks and Federal Reserve, I mentioned I didn't want to go too much into that, but the same people that gave us the Council on Foreign Relations gave us a Federal Reserve Bank, and it was both Democrats and Republicans doing that. And it's there was it's a chance. This will tell you. This is from Farm Board of Financier by Frank Vanderlip. Frank Vanderlip worked for the National City Bank, and he was one of the attendees at this secret meeting at Jekyll Island, Georgia, an island off the coast of Georgia. And his book, he wrote his autobiography a year before he died, and it was serialized in the Saturday Evening Post. And a friend of mine about 5 or 6 years ago said, Hal, if you can find the book or the magazine, he said, I will reprint it. I'll pay to reprint it. Well, it took me a long time to find it. I went online. I found one version, but all the magazines could be found online except for this one, which was unreadable. And I finally, a friend of mine in Maine gave me the book and the magazine. He found them at a yard sale in an antique store. The book was selling for like $1,500. Well, we PDF'd the book, and it's available on our website. And we reprinted this one chapter where he admitted being as secret as any conspirator. And about 1/4 of the world's wealth was represented in this meeting. And what came out of that was this Federal Reserve Bank. And Charles Lindbergh, the aviator, his dad was a congressman from Minnesota. And he said, with this, we just created the most gigantic trust in the history of mankind or the world. He said, from now on, booms and busts will be artificially created, and wars will be funded, et cetera, et cetera. And we had the Great Depression. So it's some good information, and something that, again, I know if it's kind of new to you, it's kind of like, oh my goodness, I'm being overwhelmed by here. So just take it in little bits. You don't have to have the whole picture. Stealing your money through something called inflation. And there was a book written by John Maynard Keynes. John Maynard Keynes. He was known as Candy Keynes, right? Fabian Socialist, 1919, The Economic Consequences of the Peace. And he said that inflation means that the government can steal the vast majority of its citizens' wealth, and not 1 in a million knows, unless you read his book. Oh, you're in this room. Oh, you hear other people saying it. A lot more people know now, thanks to folks like Ed Griffin. Deep state foundations, and this is something I want to get into a little bit, and then we'll kind of wrap it up. The big foundations, the Ford, the Mellon, the Carnegie, they're the ones that are funding, and most of the money was made through the free market system. The Gates Foundation. Now, can you imagine the Koch brothers? Now, I'm not a big fan of the Koch brothers. I don't want to disagree with everything they do, but some of the things they do. But can you imagine if the Koch brothers created a curriculum called Common Core and spent $10 billion or more, and every single school in the country adopted it? The critics rightly would say it looks like the Koch brothers have taken over public education and a lot of private education. Bill Gates has done that, and you don't hear much about it. You don't hear, see, and when you do hear, they're mocking it, they're ridiculing it. Bill Gates created Common Core, funded it. And today that's been introduced. And how they did it isn't that they did it through bribery, using taxpayers' money. Back in Obama in 2009 said, we have this thing called Common Core, and if you accept it, we'll give you money. So, and you'll have to adopt it, sight unseen, but here's the money. You do what you want with the money. So the money was spent, and then the states adopted Common Core. And a lot of teachers, even a lot of liberal teachers, period, left, right, moderate, they're basically facilitators. They're not teachers. 85% of the curriculum you can't mess with. You're basically teaching to the test. We'll teach you the stuff you need to know to pass the test. And they've dumbed down the reading standards, they've got history standards, the English standards, half of the stuff, they took out some of the classics and giving you government manuals. I tell you what, if I had to read a government manual as a young person, I would not be a very good reader today. I would have been very dull to begin with. So, Soros Foundation, Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, Catholics for Choice. Soros is an atheist, but he's so progressive and so free-thinking that he'll give money to Catholics for Choice, Catholics that promote abortion. Because birth control, I should say population control, is one of the major pinnacles of these deep staters. In 1952, Congress created the Select Committee to investigate tax-exempt foundations and corporate comparable organizations through the Cox Committee and then the Reese Committee. Now, this gentleman here was interviewed. He was one of the members of the committee, the Reese Committee. He was a banker, very honorable man, Norman Dodd. And he investigated the Ford Foundation. Rowan Gaither was the president, based in New York City. That was started by Henry Ford, and his grandson took it over, who was a very, very leftist. And so Mr. Gaither said to Norman Dodd, and this interview is available online on YouTube, and I think we have it on our YouTube channel. He said, why is Congress investigating us? He said, well, because you folks, the big foundations, are supporting organizations that are subversive, anti-American, and so forth and so on. And Mr. Gaither said, do you know that we operate from directives from the White House? Do you wish to know what those directives are? He said, well, yes, I do. To so alter life in the United States to make a comfortable merger with the Soviet Union possible. And poor Norman almost fell off his chair. Couldn't believe what he heard. And he said, well, would you be willing to testify? He said, this I wouldn't think of doing. There was another lady on his committee by the name of, her last name was Casey. I can't remember her first name. And she was an idealistic liberal lady. And she was to investigate the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And she found their founding meetings on these old dictaphone belts where they were planning war. This Organization for Peace was actually planning war back in 1910. Catherine Casey. And he said, it so disturbed her that she could never function again. She was so disturbed by what she found. And there's only 2 copies of this report. One of them is owned by David Rockefeller. The other one is owned by Charlotte Isabet's son. And he put it on the website. So if you have about 3 weeks of nothing to do, you can read this report. But you don't really have to read the whole thing to get the gist of it. And nothing happened. Nobody went to jail, and what have you. And I want to show this one here. Oh, here's a book I highly recommend, Crimes of the Educators, by Alex Newman and my late friend Sam Blumenfeld. Deep State, Behind the Deep State. And when I say educators, I'm not talking about elementary school teachers. We're talking about people at much higher levels. Now, this is something I think is another important. David Rockefeller just passed away within the last couple of years. 2004, he wrote his autobiography, Memoirs. And in it, he admitted, some even believe we, Rockefeller family, are part of a secret cabal working against the best interests of the United States, characterizing my family and me. And he said both the radical left and right have said this. So it's, people on both sides here. As internationalists and of conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global political and economic structure. One world, if you will. If that's the charge, I stand guilty and I am proud of it. And of course, when this book came out and people read that, you know that CNN was talking about it, Rush Limbaugh was talking about it, right? No. Nobody, other than people in certain circles. Could you imagine if he, instead of being David Rockefeller banker, if he was, let's say, a mobster? He writes this, Whitey Bulger wrote this in 2004, let's say. Yeah, I killed 30 people, and I got some buried here in Boston, I got some buried here. You think there'd be a little investigation about it? Yeah, I think so. But again, David's too big to jail. And you can find that. That book sells for about $3 online on Amazon. And if you knew my friend Don Folkers, if you ever bumped into him in the last 10 years, and he said more than 2 words to him, he'd probably hand you a photocopy of that page of that book. He lived down in coastal Maine. And again, going back into Tragedy and Hope, Carol Quigley said that the goal is to have both parties get rid of the bums in one election and the next bums come in. Nothing's changed except the D and the R. Of course, there's some good exceptions, thankfully. Let's see, I mentioned the Council on Foreign Relations already. That organization is one of these interlocking entities, and I have that book. I really highly recommend it. There's less than 5,000 members, but you find them in the military, find them in Congress, find them in the presidential administrations, find them in academia as well. And Hillary Clinton, and this is on YouTube, right? We get a lot of advice from the council, so this will mean I won't have to go as far to be told what we should be doing and how we should think about the future, because the CFR opened up a branch in D.C. back in '09. So she's admitting that they're the ones telling us what to do, right? And here are some members, past and present: Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, Tim Geithner, Paul Volcker, these are the banking people, William Crystal, the conservative neocon, John McCain, who just passed away a little while ago, Condoleezza Rice, George Petraeus, George Soros, Robert Murdoch, Rick Warren. They even have people in the Christian community involved. Richard Land, who was not on there, he's the Southern Baptist president, right? He's a member of the CFR. Every administration, from Carter, we can go back to Franklin Roosevelt. We don't show how many Trump has, but Obama had 379. Bush, too, had 516 members. And again, being a member doesn't automatically make you a deep stater, but you don't just fill an application out and pay your dues. They invite you in. And there was a man by Admiral Ward. He wrote a book called Kissinger on the Couch with Phyllis Schlafly. He was a CFR member, and he said that there's a ruling elite, and he said they have a lust to surrender U.S. sovereignty. And I remember going to a UN Day function, and the man who was speaking was a CFR member. This is the early 90s. And I'll never forget, he used the biblical reference, John the Baptist. We must get weaker, I mean the United States, and the UN stronger, you know. I said, wow. And people were applauding. Like that's exactly what the goal is. Global governance. They use the term global governance now instead of New World Order, because it got a little too controversial. By the way, we mentioned the UN earlier. Talking about when you change names, like the OSS became too hot, so they had to change it to the CIA. The Federal Council of the Churches became too liberal, so they changed it to the Federal Council of Churches. The meditation room at the UN is run by the Lucis Trust. It used to be called the Lucifer Trust, but Lucifer gets some bad press still. So they changed it years ago. So this book, Shadows of Power, highly recommend it. The Trilateral Commission is an organization that was founded in the early 70s by Brzezinski. Brzezinski's daughter, Mika, is you'll see her on every morning from Monday to Friday with Joe in the morning. Brzezinski wrote a book, Between the Ages, and he said that America was obsolete. He praised Marxism. He said that it was a further vital and creative stage of the maturing of man's universal vision. So here's a guy that was a top advisor to Carter that said that Marxism was a wonderful thing. So can we call him a Marxist without being called names? Can we actually say that about him? He's deceased now, died a few years ago. I was in Western Germany as a member of the U.S. Army in a combat arms unit, and I found out a few years later, he said that if Warsaw Nation attacked Germany, we would give them half of it without a struggle. Well, I happened to be in that half that he was willing to give to the Soviets and their allies. The goal of the Trilateral Commission, the new international economic order, and that's why all these trade agreements, the NAFTA, the World Trade Organization, the Transatlantic Partnership, thankfully, that Trump pulled us out of, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and all these other things. And I'm going to wrap it up. I'm going a little bit too long here. So Barry Goldwater, I did a term paper in college. It was, I think, a piece of junk. I got an A on it, but I looked at it, about 10 or 15 years ago. I said, boy, this isn't so well. But they thought it was okay. But I referenced Goldwater. Senator Goldwater criticized the Trilateral Commission, but he didn't do anything about it. He didn't call for investigation or anything. And then there are other groups that are sort of affiliated, the World Affairs Council, the Aspen Institute. Remember that little boy, Elian Gonzalez, when he was ripped from his family members in Havana? He went to an ashram owned by the Aspen Institute in Maryland on the Eastern Shore, and they brought in this Cuban general. He was a psychiatrist. They loaded his poor kid with drugs. And they stopped him. They wouldn't let him in the country because this stuff was illegal. He said, oh no, he's a Cuban, Lenneman, yeah. Brookings Institute, Club of Rome, population control is their big thing. The Atlantic Council, World Economic Forum, and they have their meetings around the world. Bilderbergs, and I'm probably just, I'm probably going a little bit too much here. I'm just going to kind of want to wrap things up with some recommended, I've given you all this bad news. Yeah, this is probably like a 4-hour presentation. If I could spend a lot of time in each one. Scholarly poems, but I will be happy, Bohemian Grove, I don't want to get into that right now. That will take too long here. But I did have a distant relative that was a member of that. He was a friend of Ronald Reagan. There's a few black sheep in the Shurtleff family, I'm afraid to say. I'm sure some people think I'm the black sheep, you know, some of a few of my liberal Shurtleffs. Okay, Illuminati, don't have time to go into that. Well, I do want to mention that I have a book here. It's called Proof of the Illuminati. It was published in, where is it? Yeah, here it is. I said I wouldn't roam a little bit, but I want to get this. This was published in 1798, right? And by a Scottish professor who was quite a man in his day, Professor Robinson. And Washington got a copy of this, and he agreed that he could see the influence in this country. You know, the Whiskey Rebellion, that's what that was all about. You know, when Christ was born, what did they try to do? Try to take him out. Because when you're a baby, you're the most vulnerable. When you're a new country, you're kind of vulnerable too. But they failed, thanks to people like Noah Webster. Here we go. Roger Stone, I don't know what to make of Roger Stone at this point. My friend Alex Newman, who did most of these slides for me, actually interviewed him recently. And he mentioned that the three things that if they can't get Trump out through impeachment, using the 25th Amendment. That's the 25th Amendment of the Constitution is where they try to get a president when he's incapacitated. And he had the majority of cabinet members if he's incapacitated, and the vice president becomes. It's a little complicated. I have to read it to get the gist of it. Or that, he said the last one would be Plan C assassination, which of course would be a horrible thing to assassinate anybody. And I think a lot of people are worried about that. So here are some solutions. Educate yourself. Read the Bible. Read the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, economics, theology, philosophy. And there's a good, I mentioned the magazine, The New American, which is a good place to start. You can go online and get that. But you can go to our website. We have some good information. The Constitution is the solution. State and local nullification. Refuse federal money. Once you get the money, you let all the bad things go and come in. Defund programs, agencies, and abuses. We do not want to have an Article 5 convention. There are some well-intentioned people that want to have one, some of them not so well-intentioned, including a Bilderberg attendee that would love to get their hands on this Constitution, because this is really what's one of the things that's stopping a lot of these things. You know, free speech doesn't exist in most of the world, even in places like England, in Sweden, and in Canada. A pastor in Canada was passing out pamphlets, you know, the Bible and what it says about homosexuality. He's in jail now. And they treated him miserably, you see. That should not happen. And of course we should get out of the United Nations. It's all about Congress. 218 people of Congress to turn the tide. And by the way, term limits, we have term limits every 2 years. Or in case of senators, every 6 years. And every 2 years, 1/3 of the Senate. So it's built in. But they require well-informed voters to limit them. You can just you pass a law that says you have to be out within so many years. The philosophy doesn't change, just the person that represents that philosophy. You got to change those philosophy, then it wouldn't matter who's in office as much. Education without action is frustration, and there's a bill to get us out of the UN called the HR 193, and your Congress member should be someone you know, or they should hear from you regularly. Even if they don't do what you want them to do, at least just put pressure on them. I recommend that you support Camp Constitution. We have a YouTube channel. Please become a subscriber to that. It's all free, of course. And share some of the important things we have. We have a Facebook page. If you're on Facebook, please like that. We have a press. I mentioned some of the things we publish. We have media where we go to events. Where we cover certain events. we're not as comprehensive. I mean, we're kind of a relatively small entity. We have a radio show, which actually airs just down here a little bit, but we have it on Podomatic, so you can get a lot of our shows. We have 3 or 4 years of archives. I've interviewed some pretty interesting people. Not that I'm such a great host, but I've interviewed some pretty interesting people. And you can download all of that on Podomatic.com. You just go to Podomatic, Camp Constitution, and you can download all these shows. The Sam Blumenfeld Archives, which I mentioned earlier, is an incredible resource. Last year, 75,000 downloads of Sam's Alphaphonics. How many divisions is that? Each book, right, that represent one person. Lots of people are learning how to teach their people, teach how to read. And if you download one thing, how many people, there might be 100 people that look at that. And who knows how many people are sharing that one download. So we're really excited about that. And also all the other things that go along with it. We have a family camp. It's an amazing program where we have whole families, unaccompanied minors. Our last camp ended a few weeks ago, and most of the classes, if not all of them, are up on YouTube. We had Lord Christopher Monckton, Mrs. Chris Ann Hall, who was a constitutional attorney, Mrs. Catherine White, another constitutional scholar. We had Dr. Duke Pesta, who was one of the premier experts on Common Core, and Professor Willie Soon, one of the top atmospheric scientists in the world, not just in Massachusetts. And by the way, Willie Soon is going to be speaking down in Damariscotta, September 15th at 11 o'clock. And if you're interested, I know it's a long way, but he's a fascinating guy. He's become a real good friend of mine and a good friend of Camp Constitution. We have an archive, we have a speakers bureau, and this is something we do, what I do is I go out and we sometimes host our own events and other times we're invited. So please look at our website, look at our speakers, and I love coming up here, so get me up here a lot more often, you see. And I do want to thank Bob Roy and Harold and the good people that make this happen when I come up here. We like to get Constitution Club. The goal was to have our campers kind of do it. You know, when they get home, okay, now it's another year, what do you do? Have some type of formal meeting once a week, once a month, in their home or in the local library, and to be actively involved in the community. Information tables at various venues and such. And we haven't had a lot of success with it, but we do have some around the region. We've gone as far as Michigan, Ohio, Virginia, doing these things, Pennsylvania. We do homeschool shows where we have, and the goal isn't just to get people to camp, but introduce them to some of these issues. We do ask if you can help us. We have something called PayPal, where people can go to our website and make a one-time donation or even a monthly donation, even as little as $2 or $3, $5 or what have you. Some people do 50, some people do 25, some $1 or $2. But if everybody who likes what we're doing gives us $1 a month, we're going to be able to expand, and we'll be very. So go to the website and you'll see the little drop down. And when a PayPal, you can cancel anytime you want. So, and we also know that we're in a spiritual battle. So I'm going to close with. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. And this is one of my favorite verses. The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers conspire together. The Lord and His anointed against the Lord and His anointed one. And I think Psalm 3 said that He laughs at them. He laughs at the kings of the world. So a lot of people get discouraged, and they say, "Oh, it's too late. It's all over." No, it's not. We are making lots of progress, and not just in this country too. You find that there's a lot of this sentiment all over the world, and you're not going to hear about it because they don't want the powers that be don't want you to know. They want you to stay discouraged and oh, ain't it awful? It's too late. It's not too late, and that's our number one enemy is discouragement. Never be discouraged. So, and we call this the evidence table, the literature table. So, with that, I want to thank you, and God bless.